Right, we are continuing. If we can move on the screen, please, Andrew, thank you. We're continuing in Hebrews chapter 11, and if you've been with us in recent weeks, we had an introduction. We then looked at various characters, people who are commended in this chapter of Hebrews for their faith. These are heroes of faith, and we've looked at Abel, we've looked at Enoch, and we've looked at Noah, we've looked at Abraham. And as we look at those, they're heroes of faith, what we find in Hebrews 11 is that the writer then stops to tell us something extra about these great heroes of faith that we might have missed and might not have understood as to what their true thoughts were and to where their future lies, they saw it. So we have these heroes of faith, and we're turning now to Hebrews chapter 11, and we're reading verses 13 to 16, and this is the passage. No new hero this week, though we will come back to look at heroes. But this is a summary, if you like, of what these great people have been thinking. So we read from Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have an opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. I don't know if you have aims and desires and targets in life. It's sometimes good for us to set a target, and we sometimes have those personally. I'm not thinking particularly of spiritual matters at the moment, but just people in general will say, well, I want by that particular age to have done that. I want to achieve this. I want this qualification. I would like to do that. And at times things don't work out, of course, and we reset those values, don't we? I remember as a teenager, I was a Christian, but a rather selfish Christian in many ways. I wanted three things. I wanted to play football on a Saturday in a football team. I wanted to play in a band because I play guitar, and I wanted a girlfriend. There you go. But I said, oh God, this is a concession for me as a teenager to God. Oh, but it's a Christian football team, a Christian band, and a Christian girlfriend. See, my sights were set on certain things and ideals. They happened, okay? They happened. But my mind was set on certain things, and it's very naive and immature of me to see my Christian life as what I want, and I'll add God to it. And what we see from these people, and I don't know what your targets, your aims in life are, and whether you've achieved them or whether you're hoping for that to happen, whether you're praying that will happen, but it's very important that we have faith in God. And it's that faith in God that counts most. These people had desires, right? We think of Abel, who had a desire to bring a sacrifice, an offering to God. We think of Enoch, who wanted to please God. He walked with God. He did please God. We think of Noah, who wanted to be obedient in building that ark that he was told to. But they actually set their sights higher than that. And it says several things. So first of all, we'll look at this. I've highlighted just these words from this passage. They did not receive the things promised. They did not receive the things promised, but they still had faith. And we're told, in fact, as we saw in our opening to this chapter 11, that what our faith is about is receiving what was hoped for, but also trusting in what we do not see. And these are some of the things that happened to these people. They had such faith. They did not see these things. They didn't even receive these things. Now, we have things in our life. We go to God. There are things that we are promised, and there are things that we ask for. And sometimes the things that are asked for don't happen, and sometimes they do. But there's also the things that are promised. Such was the faith of these people already mentioned in Hebrews. They didn't see the fulfillment of those promises, but they still knew them to be true. And this is at the heart of how we deal with God's things. It doesn't always happen. It doesn't always work itself out in our life as we expect it to, even when we believe that it is God's will, because we just don't get there yet. We don't see that. They did not receive the things promised. They died without receiving what they hoped for or what they promised, but their faith held to the end. They were still believing when they died. That's what it says in the opening line there, doesn't it? They still living by faith when they died, even though they hadn't received everything from God. That's not unfair, you know. God has his purposes, and we've just been singing that everything is for his glory and for my good. But it needs that faith, that trust, that when things don't go the way we want them to, we say, I still trust in God. You could read the book of Job, it's quite a long book, and see how he suffered many things that God allowed him to suffer, yet still he had faith in God. He had to learn things through that himself, but his faith was there in God. So these heroes died without receiving what they hoped for, without receiving the things they promised. And in fact, one aspect of this is they only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. That's what it said. They welcomed them from a distance, from afar. They saw what was promised. They had faith that it would come to pass, but they didn't reach it themselves personally. We looked at Abraham, didn't we, last week? And a lot of this passage is focusing particularly on Abraham, because that's the one who came just before the writer put these verses together. And you see that Abraham was called from Ur of the Chaldees, and he was called to go to Canaan. And initially he went to Haran with his family, then his father died, and eventually he then came to the land of Canaan. We know Canaan as the promised land, the land that was promised to God's people, and that is where Israel is today, although they only occupy part of the land that was promised. But Abraham never did that. Abraham never saw that. He only ever bought one small piece of land as a burial plot. And his son Isaac never saw that as a promise fulfilled. And his son Jacob, we'll come on to these characters, he never saw the promise. It was Jacob's sons in Egypt who became the head of the tribes, that eventually the nation, after 400 years, came out into Canaan and possessed the land. So we see Abraham received a promise, unfulfilled, but he still had faith in God. He welcomed these things from a distance, understanding that this world was not the place for his hopes to materialise. And this is where we see how it's important. He could look beyond that and see that it wasn't that really mattered in his heart. Something better. But his faith remains. Our faith can remain in spite of the things that we don't see the fulfilment of our promises and our requests to God. Yet our faith should remain because we know that God will do whatever is best for us and for his glory. So our faith must remain in God and his purposes. You see, they weren't focused on what God would do. Noah wasn't focused. Yes, he's practical mind, and every day he got up needing to build an ark. But his mind wasn't fully focused on just that ark, because God had said there'd be a flood and he'd go on that ark. He had faith in God's purposes for all eternity. Noah could look beyond that one thing that he was tasked to do, build that ark, and to save his family. You see, we're told in this passage that they looked on things from afar, from distance. They were strangers. They were foreigners and strangers on earth, there in verse 13. That's how they felt. This is God's world. God has created it, and he brings people to trust and believe in him and have faith in him. But then we find that those of us who believe in God, those of us who believe in Jesus Christ, are actually strangers in this world. We're foreigners. We're strangers. This is the believer's situation. This is where we are. Now, I could ask you, where do you feel most at home? It's easy for me, right? I was born in England. I even born in Croydon, right? So I've never moved out of Croydon. And I've got lots of family here. Some have moved away. Home for me is Croydon, is England, right? That's easy. Some of you will have different experiences in life. And I wonder what you really think what you really think home is. Is it somewhere overseas where you really feel that's where your family is? Or is it here? Where do you feel home? And maybe it's a different part of the country you've come from, and that feels more like home than this feels. Deep down, our home is heaven. Not on this world. Our home is heaven. Abraham was always a stranger, a foreigner in Canaan, even though it was promised to him by God. Let's read this about Abraham, verse 8. This is what we read last week. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, and like a stranger in a foreign country, he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him in the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. See that? It remained a promised land, an unfulfilled promised land in Abraham's lifetime and that of Isaac and Jacob. But he was looking beyond that. That wasn't the most important. It's an incredible promise. It's why he left Ur of Chaldees, why he left Haran to come to Canaan. Because God had promised he would be the father of millions, father of a great nation. But his eyes were not set on that land. He could look beyond it. This is what God calls us to look beyond what is happening now. Though it matters, it's serious, God will help us, God will guide us through the many practical issues of life, but he wants us to be focused, to look up. My little grandson, who's nearly 3, sometimes you tell him, look up at that tree. He doesn't look up. Look up, look. You virtually have to get his face, turn it up before he will see, right? He's not very good at looking at things. He will look up if he hears a plane, then he'll look up and he'll point to it and tell you what it is. But sometimes we're like that. We're like little children. Our peripheral vision is very poor and we're just focused on one thing. And we can't imagine anything else. And God says, look up. Look up. Not that the sky is what we're looking at, but we're looking up in our hearts and minds to heaven itself. That is where we're looking. To a city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. And that's what this passage is really showing us in Hebrews. Not this one here, but the one we're focusing on today. What we see as a practical reality for Abraham is actually the perfect illustration for all the heroes regarding what they saw as their status in this world. Yes, they had faith in God for this world, but their eyes, their thoughts, their hearts, their very souls were in heaven and focused on that. This is the key to faith. Not to think of what God might do for us in the here and now or in the short term, but to understand what it means to be in a relationship with God for all eternity. We have some wonderful examples in the scripture, of those who had faith. One in particular, Ruth. I like this illustration. Story of Ruth. Well, a lady called Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, during time of famine, went to Moab. And there they had 2 sons, and those 2 sons married 2 local women in Moab, Moabites. Well, Elimelech died, and the 2 sons died, and Naomi was left with 2 daughters-in-law. And she decided it was time for her to go back to her country, which was Israel. And she said to the 2, I'm going back, forget about me, you stay here. But one of them, Ruth, said this, where you go, she said to Naomi, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. She was looking beyond what she could have known in Moab. She could have remarried a Moabite. She could have lived, and that for her, in one sense, was home, wasn't it? Of course it was home. It's where she grew up. But she wanted to go with her mother-in-law because she saw in her mother-in-law a real faith in God that she wanted, and she wanted to follow. And so she went with her back to Israel. And ultimately she did marry. She married Boaz. See, that was faith in something beyond what she knew. Peter writes in his letter, 1 Peter 2:11, Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires. That's just how he describes us, foreigners and exiles. Now, Ruth felt like a foreigner and an exile when she came to Israel, but such was her faith in the God of Naomi, her mother-in-law, that God honoured that. And in fact, Ruth was part of the line of Jesus, the bloodline for Jesus. We think of the Jews, the Hebrews, the Israelites. They were once strangers in Egypt. It's a concept we see quite a lot, that God shows us people who are strangers and yet are blessed. Like Ruth was blessed, though a stranger in Israel. Like the Jews were blessed, though they came to Canaan as strangers. They came out of Egypt where they were foreigners, and they came to their own land. God blesses us, and we find that God blesses God, blessed is the one in Psalm 1 verse 1, blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked or stand in the way that the sinners take or sit in the company of mockers. We have to come out of the world as it is and see that our homeship is with God. And there are examples of physical movement of people from one land to another as God has taken them. But ultimately, they all believed in that heavenly place. This is a letter written from the 2nd or 3rd century, a very old letter by a Christian, we don't know who, to a man called Diognetus, about how Christians in the Greco-Roman world of that day, we're looking at 2nd and 3rd century here, how they stood out and were genuinely weird by the standards of the day. You see, we are foreigners, we are strangers, we don't look, we don't behave, we don't talk like everybody else. This is a translation of that, of part of that letter that was written. For Christians are not distinguished from the rest of people by land or language or customs, nor do they dwell in cities of their own making, nor do they speak any strange vernacular or practice a peculiar way of life. This teaching of theirs has not been deduced by the intellect or by thought of ingenious thinkers, nor do they promote any human doctrine as some are inclined to do. But while living in both Greek and barbarian cities, as each is obtained by lot and as they follow the local customs in clothing, cuisine and the rest of life, yet they show forth the wondrous and admittedly strange character of their own citizenship. They live in their own homelands but as foreigners. They share all things as citizens and suffer all things as foreigners. Every foreign country is their homeland, and every homeland is like a foreign country to them. They marry like everyone else and they bear children, but they do not expose their offspring. They share their tables but not their beds. They live in the flesh but do not live according to the flesh. They pass their days upon the earth, but their citizenship lies in heaven. Just one person's understanding of how Christians look like in the world of his day, centuries ago. It's no different today. We should stand out. We should be different. And people might call us weird, strange. Of course we're strange. We're strangers in this world. We should stand out as being different. Back in our passage in Hebrews, verse 14, people who say such things show they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Abraham, if he really thought about the country he'd come from, he could have gone back, but he did not. He was looking for a citizenship in heaven, for a city in heaven. And it's the same for us. We should be known as people who don't really belong here. Some of you may have had that feeling if you've come to this country from another country. You may feel you don't really belong here. I remember my daughter, when she was out in Colombia, and because of her darker complexion than me, and she straightened her hair, it was only in Colombia, she said, that she ever really felt she was one of everybody, in the way she looked. Just one of the little things that she observed when she was out there years ago. Because she's different to a lot of people. Like, we're all very different here. And maybe you do not feel at home. As Christians, we should not feel at home in the world, even though there's quite a bit of it we like. But we're only visiting. We're only visiting this planet. Why? What were these saints like? What was their faith all about? They were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Commended for their faith in their earthly things that they did, and yet we read that they are actually looking for a better country, a heavenly one, because that affects how we live our life in this world. We don't fit. We shouldn't fit. Abraham, as we've read, was looking forward to a city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. When we trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, when we find forgiveness at the cross, we become part of God's family. We become part of God's people who are not at home in this world anymore. And we find ourselves only visiting this planet. And it's only a matter of time before the Lord comes for us, or we die and we go to be in his presence. It's a wonderful thing. That's what we're looking for. That is our aim. So everything in this world, in that context, doesn't really matter as long as we're doing God's will. It works the other way. Jesus said, "Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and his holy angels." Let's not fall into that trap. Let's be one of those that God will say he's not ashamed to be called our God. What a thought. Is that true of you? God is not ashamed to be called your God because you have faith in Jesus Christ for salvation. We're going to finish with our final song, and then we're going to have prayers, and we're going to have the little ones come in. Let's finish with "How I Long to Breathe the Air of Heaven." This is looking forward to heaven itself.